Next to the U.S., where there are growing calls for Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito to recuse himself from two upcoming cases related to the attack on the Capitol on January 6th in 2021. The New York Times has published a bombshell story, which included photos showing that an upside-down American flag had flown outside Alito's home in Virginia in the wake of the attack on the Capitol. Well, that upside-down flag has become a symbol of the Stop the Steal movement, based on Donald Trump's false claims that the election in 2020 was stolen. Now, in response to the New York Times story, Justice Alito released a statement saying that his wife had put up the flag in response to what he called a neighbor's use of insulting yard signs, which, according to reports, were anti-Trump. The U.S. Supreme Court has two upcoming cases involving January 6th. One, whether Trump has immunity from being prosecuted for his efforts to remain in office after losing the 2020 election, and another case involving the January 6th rioters. For more on all of this, I'm joined by James Sample, a professor of law at Hofstra University, an expert in judicial ethics. Thanks so much for being with us here on France 24. First of all, should Justice Alito recuse himself from these two upcoming January 6th cases? And what do you make of his explanation of flying this upside-down flag? Essentially, that this all boils down to a fight between neighbors. Shouldn't a Supreme Court justice be above this kind of thing?
I think you framed the question very, very well. And I think that really is one of the key issues here. As to the recusal question, there's a statute that is on point that has been adopted in law for more than 50 years that applies to all federal judges, including justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. And the key language in that statute says that a judge or justice shall, which is a mandatory phrase in American law, shall disqualify himself or herself in any proceeding, and the key phrase is when their impartiality might reasonably be questioned. And the way that I tend to reason that out is to flip it into a question. Might it be reasonable to question Justice Alito's impartiality in the January 6th related cases when his family and his home is flying that flag during the period, or was flying that flag during the period in which many of the cases that are now before the court were at their germinating phase? And I think that the answer to that is that reasonable people could disagree as to whether or not Justice Alito is capable of being impartial, but that's the incorrect question. And that when you focus on the correct legally mandated question, it is reasonable to question whether or not Justice Alito would be impartial. So in that regard, I think Justice Alito must recuse, but it's a close enough call. And the reality is that in the Supreme Court, what we have is a code of ethics that is really more loophole than law, because we don't actually in the United States really have an enforcement mechanism vis-a-vis the Supreme Court justices, short of impeachment, which is a once in a century kind of scenario that basically doesn't happen. With regard to his explanation, first of all, there's the rather bizarre component of him just blaming his wife and seeming completely unbothered by the idea of doing so. But there are really only two ways to look at this. If you're walking down the street or driving past the Alito's home, you don't perceive that flag to be the flag and the political speech of Mrs. Alito. You perceive it to be the political speech of the Alitos plural, and that includes Justice Alito. So the perception there is a real problem for the justice. Although I do not believe that he will recuse, the reality here is that by blaming his wife, he's really asking us to believe something that isn't all that credible. The reality here is that Justice Alito is trying to hide behind the cover of the fact that this could have been his wife's own initiative. But even if so, this ought to be, as you point out, beneath the dignity of a Supreme Court justice.
Well, and you mentioned the code of ethics. I mean, who enforces these rules when it comes to the Supreme Court justices? Can the other justices somehow pressure him to recuse, or is this something that's totally up to him?
Sadly, it is totally up to the justice in his or her own case. It goes against every maxim of law all the way back to the Magna Carta, which is to say that the old maxim is that no one should be allowed to be a judge in his or her own case. And that's true in America in every court in the system except for one. And that's because the Supreme Court has decided on some level that it's above reproach and that it can't be told what to do. There are efforts in Congress. There have been hearings. I testified at one of them last summer to impose an enforcement mechanism on the Supreme Court As you would imagine, the Supreme Court has pushed back on that very strongly. But at a certain point, if you don't police your own house, so to speak, you can't very well cry foul when one of the other branches tries to step in and say, we need to get this under control.
Well, now, Justice Alito is not the only justice who Democrats think should recuse himself from these January 6th cases. You have another justice, Clarence Thomas, whose wife actually sought to overturn the results of the 2020 election. Should he also recuse himself, in your opinion, from these two cases?
The case for Justice Thomas's recusal is significantly stronger than the case for Justice Alito's. And unfortunately, because Justice Thomas, he's literally ruling on issues of law that could have an impact on whether or not the events in which his own spouse participated are deemed to be illegal, were deemed to be an insurrection. That is the absolute definition of a conflict of interest. Unfortunately, because Justice Thomas has refused to recuse himself from those cases, he's created a kind of quasi-precedent that gives cover to Justice Alito. The way I look at it, Justice Thomas not recusing is sort of the judicial ethics equivalent of a felony. Justice Alito not recusing under this flag scenario is a bit more of a misdemeanor, but both are problematic nonetheless.
What does all of this say for the legitimacy of the court? One of the reasons we're doing this story is just really how shocking it is. I would never have imagined in my lifetime that a Supreme Court justice would be caught flying an upside-down flag in his yard. Doesn't it just further deteriorate how the court is viewed by the public?
I think that you're absolutely correct in your frame, and I think you're absolutely correct in your concern. I think it's worthy of doing this story for that very reason, which is to say that many of the issues in law are black and white matters of law. But many of the issues in law, and particularly in the law of a democracy, the law of a constitutional republic, are issues of norms, of compliance with the spirit of the law, not just the technical requirements of the law. This is the kind of thing that undermines the entire enterprise of separation of powers, the entire enterprise of an independent judicial branch, and that calls into question the legitimacy of the rulings that come from that branch. Famously, the old phrase goes that the judiciary has neither the power of the purse, Congress, nor the power of the sword, the executive branch. The judicial branch depends on the public having faith in its rulings for the legitimacy of those rulings and for those rulings to be followed. When you undermine that legitimacy, you're doing real harm, not just to the institution, but to the rule of law.
Before I let you go, can we briefly talk about one of these upcoming cases involving former President Trump? The court is deciding essentially whether the former president is immune from criminal prosecution as it relates to his efforts to overturn the results of the last election. During oral arguments, were there any hints as to how the court might rule?
It's a good question. And, France was very helpful to the United States, or to then America, in fighting a revolution against a country that thought a king could do no wrong. Alas, it appears that there are justices on the Supreme Court, and certainly a candidate for president, again, who is trying to essentially install himself as a king who can do no wrong. The oral argument in that case indicated that there are some justices in the conservative majority who are taking seriously the idea that a president of the United States would be immune even if he assassinated his political opponent just for the sake of doing so. That is anathema to the idea of America. It's anathema to the idea of the rule of law. And it is a very, very precarious time for the United States as a democracy that is supposed to be a shining city on a hill.
We'll have to leave it there on that very serious note. James Sample, a professor of law at Hofstra University, expert in judicial ethics. Thanks so much for joining us here on France 24.
Thank you.
Next to the world's